The French, as you'll see, have a lot in common with the Spanish colonizers in that they're also Catholic and will begin the process of converting the native people they encounter to their brand of Christianity. The French begin to colonize the area around Quebec beginning around 1541 due to their interest in the fur trade. But it's not until about 1663 that Louis XIV decides to properly situate what he calls New France by appointing a government for the region. So this territory is met with aggression on the part of both Dutch as well as British settlers who also want control of this land. But as you'll see, the French really will leave their footprint on this particular area. Now, what's interesting is that, like the Spanish, we see these images of the colonizers arriving. So there's the boat. We know in this case that it's the French because it has this blue flag which has this gold symbol on it. And you'll notice that this figure, which is the personification of France, has the same symbol as does this Native American figure. That symbol is what we call the fleur-de-lis. That's what it looks like up close. It's usually gold with a blue background. You might also recognize that symbol because if you're a football fan, you've seen it before on the uniforms of the players for the New Orleans Saints. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense because New Orleans was also colonized by the French. And so that symbol of the fleur-de-lis relates to their French origins. So what we're seeing is the French boat arriving in New France, in this case what is modern-day Canada, cloaked in the garb of France, presenting this unclothed Native American figure, covering him with a garment that also represents France, and presenting him with this image that shows the Holy Trinity. So there's the God the Father, there's the Holy Spirit represented by the dove, and Jesus, who's the Son, beneath him. And as you can see, the reception is quite great, right? They arrive on the shores. This Native American figure is thrilled to have this new beautiful cloak and has bowed down before this image of their faith. And the figure of France also points up to yet another symbol of Catholicism. So the message we get is that the French are welcome to the shores of what is New France, that the native people are very hospitable, not at all aggressive. In fact, they're so accepting that they bow down before. So this hierarchical viewpoint where France is higher and the native figure is lower is something to take notice of. And also, if you look in the background, you can see that the wigwam huts that belong to this native group, they've already placed the cross, the symbol of Christianity, there at the top. So the propaganda that French people would get is like, it's going smashingly in the New World. Yes, the natives are so happy that the French have finally arrived to civilize them, to cloak them in their garb, and to present them with a new religion, as though they'd been longing for it. Now, we know that this is propaganda and this is not necessarily true, but this is what the French, or the illusion and the impression that the French artists would want you to have. The French will also teach many Native American groups to create works like this one, which is the front of an altarpiece. So the decoration of their church is also very important. These floral motifs were incredibly popular in France during the 17th century. And what's really interesting is that this work, which may well have been done by Native American craftspeople who were taught by the French settlers, also created interesting works that show this interest in botanicals and floral design and patterning, but yet still reflect Native American life. So we see how they live in these kind of tents. There's a man smoking a pipe here. And you really get the sense of Native American life, but yet there's this needlework that's done that shows the influence of the French colonizers. Also, like the Spanish, the French will move down into what is the modern-day United States, in this case, Ohio, and they too will encounter Native American art and evidence of earlier civilizations. This particular one is called the Great Serpent Mound. So it's like the head of a snake here at the top, and then it goes down quite a way. This is actually 1,254 feet in length, and it is about 20 feet wide. What's really interesting is that you'll notice that there are two dates. So for a long time, we thought that it dated to about 200 BCE to 400 CE. And now the general consensus leads more towards the date being around 1070. And the reason for that is that what we think happened is that this group, the Hopewell or the Mississippian, had seen Halley's Comet, which would have been like this undulating, moving star that crossed through the night sky. And we know, because of science and history, that Halley's Comet passed through the North American sky in 1066. So it may be that this work was created as kind of a reflection, because clearly it's meant to be seen from this aerial perspective, and yet flight doesn't exist, right? So it's kind of one of those things that we're endlessly curious about, because they created something that they couldn't themselves see, but it was best seen from above. Another interesting work that deals with the French is this piece that I think in so many ways shows how there was that miscommunication between indigenous groups and European colonizers. So the artist here is Jacques Lemoyne de Morgue, and it is a painting that he did while he was traveling with René de Laudonnière, this gentleman, who was an explorer, who was coming on a second trip. So an earlier group of French settlers, French Huguenots, had been led by Jean Ribault, and they had landed on the east coast of Florida, pretty close to modern-day Jacksonville, and they claimed this land for France, and while they were there, they built this column, and as you can see, they've placed the blue background with the gold fleur-de-lis there, right? So this was marking this territory as belonging to France. Now, 2 years later, René de Laudonnière, this finely dressed gentleman, returns, and he is met by Athor, who is the chief of this Native American group, the Timucuan, and he takes him to see the column. And what we see de Laudonnière looking at is this scene where they've covered the column in garlands of flowers and plants. They've laid out this feast before it, and it seems as though the native people are kind of worshiping this column. Now, what we think in reality was happening is this was a display of friendship, but it was likely interpreted by the Europeans that, oh, these silly native people were worshiping this object rather than offering them their friendship, which is probably what was happening. It's also interesting that the French artist really emphasizes kind of the refinement, the civilized clothing that's worn by de Laudonnière, in contrast to the very animalistic quality of Athor. He's got what look like tails that come out of his head. His fingernails are claw-like. His body is tattooed. He even has what looks like a tail that comes down between his legs. So all of this indicates that difference between the kind of, quote, civilized Europeans and these, quote, primitive natives. It's one of the great examples of an encounter that was clearly kind of misunderstood. In fact, this artist also wrote a narrative description of this work, and he talks about this notion of sexual liberty, and he says, quote, "The chief took them to the island where Ribault had set up a stone column with the arms of the King of France. When the French came closer to the column, they found Indians worshipping the stone as an idol. Athor kissed the stone with the same reverence that his subjects showed him. His men also kissed the column, and they asked us to do likewise." So there is this sense that they are worshiping it rather than extending friendship, which, you know, aids in this kind of propaganda and this European belief that this land was theirs for the taking.